All right, now I got too much time. I didn't prepare this much. I'd like to thank Carrie very much for inviting me here. So I just want to give you some thoughts on, share with you some of the thoughts I have recently working on this issue. I changed my title a little bit, trying to fit the theme of this session, where I prominently have abrupt change in the feedback. The thing here is a relation between the two issues. And especially, I want to give a sort of a perspective from both paleo and the modern combined view from two motivations. One is that when I worked on this, as you can tell when I talk to you, I started with the paleo, the whole thing, but I found there are questions I couldn't understand in the paleo, and I couldn't even understand in the modern because people haven't studied that. So it forced me to have to work on the modern part. Okay, so I think it just tells us that there are some important issues, especially related to the abrupt change in the feedback. Those are so complicated, sophisticated, such that it's not like a paradigm we already know present day, so we just parallel carry it to the paleo. It's really we have to get all the information together, trying to understand it as overall together. And the other thing is that I was trying, when I was preparing this talk, trying to read some literature, some review. What I found interesting is that the review, either they just review present or they just review past. So I think it'll be actually interesting, just put everything together, just see what is the overall picture. Oops. Okay, I thought it would be interesting to start this Africa issue. Where did it start? Abrupt change in the land atmosphere feedback. It seems to me that it was really the precipitation, the decline of precipitation in the 60s. And that really got people attention. And then you have Charlie, imagine at 75, that's about the time he was proposing the problem. And if you watch this continuously coming down, it is conceivable. You see the land, people doing the degrading, the grazing, and the human activity might be causing this. So that was probably motivation, one of the strong motivation at that time. So the question is why it declined so sharply at this time. Is this land, people doing something, then feedback on the atmosphere really happening here? So that was one of the motivation, I guess. The other one, we just saw that, and from the paleo perspective, Peter Dominica, his data showed a very interesting and a very important abrupt change here, which is probably the most prominent one over land, terrestrial, over the last in the Holocene. So that give you, naturally raises the question, why so abrupt? Okay. Now, it's sort of the first thought you will have is that abrupt change, strongly related to the positive feedback, which is very reasonable. And then Martin Clausen, his group showed this in the intermediate model where they have the solar radiation very gradual, but in their model, they can have much more abrupt change in the vegetation as well as in precipitation. So in their case, the interpretation was actually very reasonable, and they did a test, confirmed in their model, is that because they have very strong positive vegetation feedback, as Charlie proposed, is albedo and feedback, we'll come back a little bit later, that therefore you produce multiple equilibrium in the coupled system, therefore you tend to have abrupt change even if the forcing is gradual. So this is where I was before I started working on the problem, and I saw that there's a strong positive feedback there, and there was multiple equilibrium, everything. But what I found when I started work on this, I found actually this is not simple. So that just pushed me to come back, think about this thing again. Are we really this really so definite results, or we should rethink about some of the results. So now let's look at this. Again, the same record, except now we extend to 2000, after 2000. So you look at this, you can imagine that this is not obvious declining trend here. So it's coming back, about halfway coming back. So I think, and you probably will have some thoughts, and also, Charney at this time, look at this, and probably the first conclusion you will have that definitely not all of them is caused by the human activity, okay? So at least there's a substantial part caused by natural variability is going to swing back and forth, okay? So, so that puts some doubt on this question. This recent evidence, which was originally motivated us to think about this, actually may not be as strong as we have originally thought. Now, there are further evidence from modeling side further confirming this. And I'm showing this again. The blue line, the red line was the observation. The blue line was from a model simulation where they prescribe the sea surface temperature as an observation, then simulate this. Okay? And they can simulate this precipitation change very well. Then they further did a simulation, did analysis. The point is that you can look at this part. This EOF mode related to the Sahara precipitation change very much simulate this average change here. It's related to the ocean temperature change. Okay? Because in their model, there's no interactive vegetation, there's no positive feedback. It's just a pure atmospheric model with a simple land model, fixed vegetation, everything. But because they have the observed SST change, especially in their model, they did experiment, seem to suggest was actually the Indian Ocean and Pacific here is producing this trend. Okay, so what it says is that the ocean and natural climate variability beyond atmospheric land system might be forcing this. Now, of course, you have the issue, what is causing this natural variability? Maybe land atmosphere feedback is implied in that. That's a legitimate question. Okay, but at least in the first order, the natural climate variability is a very important factor in causing this recent Africa climate change. Just go back to this, the relation between surface temperature, the SST, and Africa precipitation. You can go back further. This is the one plot Peck showed a couple of days ago. The point is that this African monsoon, well, they picked the index here, maybe not the same as Sahara, but at least it shows that he was trying to show that this index is very much related to the ocean temperature change. So the point is that natural variability could play a very important role in this. And you can see here, the recent part was very tiny, the decline was a very tiny part compared to this natural variability. Okay, so it's just to emphasize the importance of natural variability, multi-decadal to centennial variability playing a role when we talk about the human activity, including global warming. We have to be careful. If it's a trend or it's natural variability, we need to be careful on this. Now, it's not to say that there's no evidence of land atmosphere feedback. Now, this is a paper showing a synthesis of many of the model results. It's all people working together, different model across about a dozen model. They trying to test the soil moisture feedback. Okay, they did initial value experiments. If the soil is a little bit wet, then see what happened next. And you can see that very consistently across all the models in these three regions, including Africa here, which is a hot spot where it potentially says that if it's wetter, then you got a local moisture recycling intensifies, then more precipitation, then so then you start to form then even wetter. So it's potentially forming positive feedback. Okay, now this is important, but there are two questions. First of all, soil moisture feedback is not equivalent to vegetation feedback. If you have some region, you just make it wetter, nothing else, everything else being the same, of course, you will evaporate more, then that's more natural, okay? When you have vegetation, it's not that obvious, as I'll show you, it's not obvious. And perhaps the other one, even more important, is that this is model results, okay? Now, in this case, all the models are consistent. Regardless of consistent or not, there's always the issue. What about in the real world, okay? So how do we identify this feedback in the real world? Now that's a very tricky issue, okay? Because you cannot deforest, all Amazon, you can't just do that experiment, okay? So you have to be clever to find a way. The real world only have one realization. So how can you, from the realization, you get an interaction, atmosphere, and the land, they interact with each other. So you have to be a little bit smart trying to identify the part of signal that is due to land feedback, okay? So come back to that. So that's actually a very important issue. So when I was working on this, I started to realize actually almost, all the positive feedback, land, the vegetation feedback on the atmosphere, all of them are from model, all of them, okay? Therefore, as you will see later, when you have a model which goes to different direction, then you start to wonder, well, does that mean this model is different, or or is other model are different? Okay. So the observation is very important. Just give you an example. This shows. Just look at this. Both are similar. One curve is precipitation. One curve is a vegetation index from satellite observation. Okay. So you can see them interannually. They go together. Some years dry, then next year come back. Some years dry, next year come back. Basically, it just follows precipitation. Now, that's very easy to understand. So because you have more precipitation, you got more vegetation. So you look at this, you see a big change in vegetation. You see precipitation increase, too. Is this the feedback of land to the atmosphere, or is simply representing a response to the precipitation? Where the precipitation, especially locally, especially in the semi-desert region, they have a huge natural variability, okay? So then you can cause just to simply force this change, okay? So from observation, it is a difficult issue. How do you extract? But that's all the data you have, okay? You got one realization, that's all the data have. So from observation, there is a simple technique. You can actually try to identify which part is feedback, which part is a forcing. Put it simply is that you have two time series. They work together, coupled or together. So the part of the feedback, the land, the part of the forcing is, you cannot look at instantaneous correlation, because that's, you mix the causality. So if you want to look at the information is the atmosphere forcing the ocean, you should look at the part of the correlation where the atmosphere is leading the ocean. And on the other hand, if you want to look at the land feedback on the atmosphere, you should look at the part of the correlation that is the land leading the atmosphere. Okay, so the information is in the land leading atmosphere part. That's a simple way to put it. So there's a simple way you can actually in go detail really trying to identify this, quantify this. So I got curious about this. I said, well, okay, then we just, because there's nothing in the observation. So I said, well, we do have observation of the remote sensing, the vegetation, the NDVI or FPAR. It's basically the greenness of the vegetation for about 20 years. And then we have precipitation, so we can just use this technique to see if we can extract at the present day in the observation, do we have positive feedback or not. So this is the result. I think this is probably the only result we have so far for large-scale feedback from the observation. Now, the positive means it's a positive feedback. The negative means the negative feedback. Look at Africa region. I mean, it's positive and negative. There's nothing significant. This is a Monte Carlo significance test. In Africa region, there's nothing significant. Okay? So from this, I would say that I don't have clear evidence there's a positive vegetation feedback from the observation. And curiously, if I look at this, the two or three places where it is significant, one is Northeast Brazil, where it's significant, very significant. And the other one was China here, also significant. Okay, I haven't had time to look at it in detail. Okay, there's also an issue. This methodology is univariate, so it's assuming everything feedback is local. That's certainly not true. Okay, so I'm working on this further, trying to work on this later. But this is nevertheless, this is the first crude feedback estimate from the observation. And from this perspective, you don't really see evidence of strong positive feedback in Africa. It's not to say that there's no feedback. If I do the same thing for temperature, okay, then you can clearly see very significant feedback in borrowed temperature. Okay, this boil temperature positive feedback. We know that. You gotta, especially in the snow season, when the season starts, if you have more vegetation, then you reduce albedo, therefore you absorb more solar radiation, then it's warmer, then you favor the snow melting and the vegetation increase, so you got the positive feedback. And in this case, you can calculate the explained variance by the feedback can amount to about 20 to 30% of the total natural variability. That's huge. Okay, that's huge. So it's just to precipitation, it's a very subtle feedback. To temperature is much more robust from observation. So as a result, by looking at all these results, my conclusion is that I don't see significant observational evidence there's a positive vegetation feedback in North Africa. Okay. Now let's look at the paleo perspective. And actually, this is where I started to think about this. You saw Martin Clausen's climate results shows that simulating this abrupt change of vegetation in their model, okay, it was a positive feedback result. So I got curious on this, so I also did a simulation using a fully coupled model. It's called FOAM LPG, fully coupled atmosphere, ocean, and dynamic vegetation model, GCM model, to simulate this. So we simulate the last 6,500 years. So you can see that we were able to simulate this abrupt change in vegetation. So at first I was very happy because because Martin's interpretation was very reasonable. That would be absolutely your first thought. So I said, well, great. I reproduced results, so that's good. I'm going to write a paper. Until I see this one, I'm completely lost. Look at this one. This is the precipitation in our model in the same region. And if you have very strong positive feedback, you would have, when vegetation collapses, you would expect the strong collapse in the precipitation, which was the case in Martin Clausen's case, but not in this case. If you look at this, literally, it will imply there's no strong positive feedback, because when vegetation collapses, precipitation doesn't change too much. Okay? So then that's where I got lost. And this raised two questions. I said this implied there's no positive feedback. Is really true? Okay? So that's the question. Is really true that there's no positive feedback in the model, in this model? The second is even more confusing. I always thought the collapse, abrupt change, you have to have this multiple equilibrium, positive feedback, multiple equilibrium to have change. But if I don't have this multiple positive feedback and multiple equilibrium, how can I even produce abrupt change in this case? On the other hand, I know this model is a physically consistent model, so it's something happening here. So then I was forced trying to understand these two issues. So I first go to this one. Do notice here, in this model, very different from Martin Clausen's intermediate model, because the GCM has huge natural variability, okay, which is very reasonable in the semi-desert region. Just naturally, some year you have rain, some year you don't have rain, just pure natural variability there. So what I did was that I just get a conceptual model, very, very simple. I'm not going to show you the equation. It's just the first order differential equation. I just want to conceptually to understand, is it possible at all, if the system does not have multiple equilibrium, I can produce abrupt change? Okay, is it possible at all? Because I thought that it's impossible, so something strange happening. So here I'm showing you the model in two regimes. In one case, it's very weak positive feedback. In one case, very strong positive feedback. So in this case, you can see that I changed sort of a solar radiation, coded solar radiation in the simple model. So you can see the vegetation collapse. And because strong positive feedback, you can see precipitation also collapse. So that's very reasonable. In this case, if you smoothly change your insolation, the vegetation decreases. Okay, but the precipitation, first of all, it doesn't collapse so sharply. That's because there's no multiple equilibrium. So there's a transition. Okay, and furthermore, you can see in precipitation, it's very little change. When this changes so much, it doesn't change too much. That's simply because there's very little feedback. By construction, I construct a model that way, so I know that. So that's consistent. So now, you say, as I said, well, because my model has so much noise, so I saw the noise probably can do something. So I add a noise. Now, when you add noise, even if at the beginning you have multiple equilibrium abrupt change, if the noise is strong enough, you wiped out that collapse completely in all of them. And of course, if you don't have them, of course, you add noise, the simple white noise, you don't have the abrupt change either. That's actually very easy to understand because noise acts as sort of a diffusion. In a sense, equilibrium is defined by the equilibrium. If you have a very fast noise, the system never even have time to reach the equilibrium. So equilibrium becomes irrelevant, okay? So you just follow the noise, go back and forth. The equilibrium doesn't matter anymore. So there's no. So then the question is, well, still I haven't solved my problem. The thought I had at that time was that then I realized that I had one problem, one thinking wrong at this time because I add precipitation as white noise. Now itself is reasonable, but in a real system, the vegetation fields is not precipitation. Instead, it feels soil moisture. Now, what's the difference between soil moisture? Soil moisture is forced by precipitation, but soil moisture has a much longer memory than the atmosphere, which is maybe a couple of days. So soil moisture you can have monthly or even into-annual time scale memory. So the point is that if you consider soil moisture, the stochastic forcing to the vegetation is no longer white noise. Instead, it's red noise. That means you could have time scale of the noise comparable with the time scale of the vegetation itself. Now, in this case, you can imagine there might be something interesting happening. Remember, as I said at the beginning, why the noise completely wiped out? Because the noise is so fast, so the system doesn't even have time to feel the equilibrium, right? So now if you slow down the time, so you can start to feel the system sort of sitting in the middle. On the one hand, it knows something about the equilibrium state. There's a green state, there's a state there. On the other hand, it's not like here there's no noise, comfortably sitting wherever it is. Instead, it's going to be pushed by the noise, okay? So as a result, I wouldn't go into detail except showing you one slide next, is that when you have this red noise, then the collapse in this unstable case occurred again, okay? Now that's okay, this is reasonable. The most surprising in this case is that the system, even if originally there's no multiple equilibrium, it's stable. And when you start to have red noise, you can still have very abrupt change in the vegetation system. But not in the precipitation system. Well, that's by definition always true in my construction because I don't have strong positive feedback, okay? So this actually is very similar to my simulation from LPG. Well, some other model, for example, this climber tend to be more in this regime when they have very strong positive feedback, so they can have both collapse abruptly. There are other models in behaviors I didn't show you. So for example, this Dutch model, easy built, they have strong positive feedback, but they don't have abrupt change. Okay, I think in that case, because that's my speculation, the QG atmosphere model has very strong synoptic noise, so therefore they tend to be in this regime. And there was another model, McGill has a model, vegetation model, is similar. These three, they have the exact same vegetation model. Okay, the atmosphere model, ocean model, different. In this case, they have very little noise, and also they have very weak feedback. Therefore, they have no abrupt change in neither of the vegetation and the climate system. So the system, you can have all this different behavior depending on the feedback in the system. So just one note on this, as I said, I call this stable collapse, that even if I don't have instability system, I can still have this abrupt change. That is that essentially in this system, I'm showing you, if you can think about it as this is a PDF of the state, if you do a little bit more theoretical. So if you have white noise, you can see because system is monostable, you're getting one preferred state, stay here, okay? So, but as you increase the time scale of the noise, then you start to see it become bimodal structure, okay? So that's how this jumping between the green state and desert state occurred. So even if in this system, I know there's no multiple equilibrium, and it's all stable, but because when I have this red noise, I can produce this multiple state. It's almost like you have a multiple equilibrium state. You have this two preferred state, okay? So just confirming you, this is not a visual, luckily I pick one. It's really probability. It's very robust results. So this says at least, if you see abrupt change in vegetation, it's not guaranteed you have to have very strong positive feedback in the multiple equilibrium in the system. And now let's go back to the model. As I told you, I said it implied there's no positive feedback. Now, you really want to prove it, at least in the model, so I can prove it. So first I did statistically, as I showed you, to the observation. Now that's negative feedback. Then I simply just, because in the model world, I can do experiment. Okay. So what we did is that we reduced vegetation cover in that region. So you can see this shows that that's the initial condition. Then we run a model, run like 100 members, so it's ensemble. Then you average them. You see what is response. So this shows leaf area index. So you can see that leaf area index every growing season, that's for 4 years, okay? So they decrease, every growing season decreased, okay? But this precipitation, leaf area index decreased, precipitation increased, okay? So that's just confirming in this model, it is true. It's not a statistic method problem. The statistic method actually is correct, showing that it is really, in the model world, it is really negative feedback. And if you want to go to the reason, now top layer soil moisture is indeed increased. It basically follows the precipitation. And transpiration is decreased. That's reasonable because leaf area index is reduced. Now in our model, it's a bare ground evaporation increased because you reduce the vegetation, the grass fractional coverage. So you increase bare ground coverage. So then in the Holocene, in this case, it's very, very wet in the wet season, so you get a lot of evaporation, simple evaporation from the model. It turns out in this version model, the evaporation increased more than the decrease of transpiration. As a result, you got a more local moisture recycling, so you got this negative feedback. Okay, so it's just confirming that in the model, it is negative feedback. And it produced abrupt change, okay, like we did before. That gets me started to think about this actually is a complicated issue. Now, you go back, think about the land feedback. What we said usually, our vision is that you have bare ground compared with, let's say, forest. That's best comparison because the bare ground evaporation is small, and forest evapotranspiration, you get a deep pool water here, transpiration, so it's very big. So that's a moisture feedback that help local recycling. Not so much so for grassland, right? Because grassland, you don't have so much deeper rooting system, and leaf area index is not very, very large. So its evapotranspiration is not as much as you expect from tree, okay? So this actually could be similar to bare ground. Also, albedo feedback, similar. That is, if you compare forest with bare ground, of course, forest maybe, deep forest 0.1 something. This, 0.2 something, and even 0.3 desert. So you have a sharp difference in albedo. But if you go to grassland, just imagine, grassland savanna region in Africa, that albedo is not too much different from, it's not like a deep forest here, okay? So the albedo difference is also not too much sharp contrast, okay? And furthermore, this rooting system that also matters because land, water pool is not like ocean. It's like infinite pool, okay? Here you have basically finite pool, except when you go very, very deep. In the case of tree, you can take some water here, then you evaporate. If it's grass, mostly shallow rooting system, it's a zero-sum game. You evaporate it, then the ground lose, bare ground lose evaporation. So the total actually may not change it too much. So the point is that if you consider this, the vegetation feedback we have been thinking in our mind, both in hydrological part and energy part, really favorable is for tree. Now for grass, it's much less so, just conceptually, right? So if you think about this, and it will be interesting to think is that, let's see, if you increase vegetation, okay, you reduce albedo, therefore you increase the energy for convection. And in the meantime, you increase evapotranspiration. So both favor the increased precipitation. That's true. In the meantime, when you increase vegetation, you transpirate that. Then soil moisture is reduced. So then the soil moisture effect actually is the opposite because you reduce soil moisture, you reduce evaporation, and you increase albedo, it's darker sorry, the drier soil, so it's darker, sorry, it's lighter, and therefore you reduce energy. Then this actually is opposite effect, trying to reduce precipitation. So for trees, you tend to prefer this because you have a deep rooting and you have a lower albedo. So both cases, it favors this. But for grass, actually, you can be favorable for this. Okay? Therefore, for grass, you can imagine as soon as vegetation change, naturally, you will have to produce this. Okay? So that's why I call this indirect vegetation feedback. You have to produce this. And therefore, there is something negative there trying to drag you down with the indirect effect. Okay? So conceptually, it's not hard to understand. And I just want to make sure. So in our model, we did experiment. As I showed you experiment before. When we have grass, that was a negative feedback. That's grass feedback. It's hard for you to see. This is really just a preliminary plotting. It's contour dashed line, so that's negative. If I do exact same experiment, instead of putting grass, I replace tree. Now this becomes positive feedback. Okay? So it's not saying that the model can never produce positive feedback. It's just in this region, in the Holocene over there, it's really grass. So it's grass versus bare ground. So that's why the positive feedback is not very, very strong. Therefore, you don't have very strong positive feedback in this case. So this is not just particularly for our model, okay? And this just shows you some PMIC model. And you can see that in one of the model, we don't need to know the name of the model, just one of the model, you do have positive feedback in present and Holocene, but in some other model, it's actually negative feedback, okay? So even though for soil moisture feedback, it's so robust, once you go to vegetation feedback, it becomes very, very diverse results. I think partly because of this complicated issue, this much complicated issue. So now what about if you come back to Peter's call, you may say, well, in that case, I see clearly abrupt change. How does that fit this story here? Maybe our model completely is inconsistent with Peter's call, right? But I'll argue actually within the probably observation uncertainty, at least it's as consistent as the Martin Clausen's results. Because look at Peter's call. Now this is again from Jess Atkins' paper. This is the dust. Okay, so it goes this way. This is dust. This is a younger dryer. And then suddenly increase here. Now, Jess also showed two other. One is SST. One is opal flux, which is sort of like upwelling. Now, this is really an ecological indicator. Okay. Now, this two may be more relevant to the climate, right? One is SST. One is opal. If it's upwelling, then it's probably related to the wind. Okay, so what you can see is that this ecological index is very abrupt change, but the climate index is much less so at this time. At least you can compare with the younger dryers. At the younger dryers, you have all of them really abrupt. So younger dryers, in this case, is abrupt change in climate and vegetation. Okay, that's very abrupt. But compared with younger dryer, look at here. The vegetation, you do see very strong collapse, but in climate, it's not very clear. So you could have a scenario in this case where the climate is decreasing relatively gradually, but the vegetation system, once you go through a certain threshold, it just can't survive. Then the land surface become dust. Then you blow the dust here. Okay, that's perfectly reasonable. So from this, one implication to paleo observation is that you could have different behavior. Just by looking at one core, if you look at multi-proxy, you might be able to help to identify the feedback if you can separate the climate-related proxy versus ecosystem-related proxy. If they go all together, then that's sort of a simple, not too much to talk about. But if you have both of them collapse, okay, and that's a very strong indication there is a strong positive feedback in this system. On the other hand, if it's the climate system more or less gradual, but ecosystem more abrupt, well, then you don't know. Then you're not sure, okay? So from here, I would say that The abrupt change we identified using Peter's call as an example. It's not a definite proof. It's not a sufficient proof of a positive feedback for vegetation on climate. Now, I think I still have one more motivation for this. I think this puzzle I still don't understand. Now, this might still be, I think this probably is the strongest proof that there is a positive feedback somehow related to vegetation. And Carrie already showed some two-dimensional map. This just showed sort of in the zonal average sense. This is proxy records. At Holocene, you have this shrubland, different vegetation, while present day is just basically desert scenario. So the implied precipitation should be at this line, almost like 200, 300 millimeter. Yet, in all the models we have so far, in the middle Holocene, in the PMAP results, you can increase precipitation, move the rain belt northward, but none of them can get here, far away from this. So the question is why? I mean, we already know the orbital forcing, and we also know, and Kurzbach and I, we did something on the SST forcing, which has been shown actually very robust. The SST in this case is playing positive feedback, but yet this model with SST still far away from this. You got to have something else, okay? So it's vegetation, but lots of models, as I showed you, the vegetation, some positive, some negative. When you get here, it doesn't get here either. So, so there is a problem here. So to me, my mind is that thinking is that this perhaps is still, if okay, this proxy, the implication is right, okay? And then this is very strong evidence that our model is deficient in generating this, and we need additional feedback. Well, what could that be? There might be several other things. Just our pointing one potential thing is dust. And you can see the dust here in the since 60s. That was also increasing. When you're getting drier, you have more dust. And the dust has effect. If you have a dust, the first effect is it blocks short wave because the size is pretty big, so you can block short wave. And as a result, you can tend to produce a cooling effect. Now, if it is a cooling effect over land, then you can imagine you can form a positive feedback, right? Because you got a little bit of dust, so you got land cooling. Therefore, you reduce monsoon, reduce precipitation, then even more dust. Okay, and vegetation cover reduce, even more dust. So that give you feedback into the positive feedback, which none of the models have so far. Okay, now, but the story is a little bit more complicated. The dust also absorb long wave, like from surface, long wave, and then radiates back. So now, if you look at the effect, net effect here, in the direct effect, it's actually not obvious if it's a cooling effect or warming effect. I've seen two model. One model produces a cooling, one model produces warming. So I don't know which one is right. Now, makes things even worse. This dust aerosol called indirect effect. That is that when you have this dust, it provides nuclear for cloud formation. Now, the dust problem is related to cloud problem. The cloud is the most uncertain part of the model yet. Okay, so the dust issue actually become very complicated. It's because related to the direct effect, indirect aerosol effect could be very complicated. The good news is that in this generation of model, for example, GFDL and NCAR, they are going to have the indirect effect in both models. Although I don't know if they have the dynamic vegetation, also the land cover, also dust source, coupled everything all together. I'm not sure about that part, but at least the indirect effect here. So potentially, we might see a study starting really to explore this effect. And when I talk to both sides, GFDL and CCSM people working on this, they also told me their impression so far is that when they have indirect effect, it tends to be cooling. So that will favor the positive feedback I just mentioned at the beginning. Okay, so that could be one potential issue. So when you have a dust coupled with vegetation now, it's indirectly sort of involved in the whole process. Okay, but it's through the dust. You might be providing some feedback, which the model we don't have yet. Okay. Well, we see that the Africa here is very uncertain. I'm telling you that I'm not sure, I don't understand in the past, because there's some different results, some positive, some negative. And the present, I'm not sure about it either. And it's interesting, it's probably not sure about the future. This just shows you that IPCC results. You can see in West Africa here that, where is the West Africa? Yeah, so this shows precipitation. So this region, you can see that it's really actually almost the node line of the precipitation change, okay? And also, this is just the consistency between different models. It produces the same sign of precipitation. Again, look at Africa, West Africa here is a sort of a node line region. You can see this, all the ensemble, different models in this region. It's almost like half-half, okay? So this just tells you that it's really a tough area. It's very very uncertain, from the past. There are questions there from present, and there are issues there even for the future. It's a region where it could be very tough to make a decision. So I'll conclude here. For the present, from observational side, I haven't identified clear evidence of significant positive feedback, vegetation feedback in the North Africa region yet. Okay. And the model results are inconsistent, diverse. So I think the important thing is that, at least for present, we should make some further effort trying to understand this, including more analysis, improving the analysis method, and also we have longer data. We have 10 more years, and I did this 20-year data. Now we have 30-year data. We might have more robust statistical results. From the past, the available records of abrupt change itself, because it's mostly an ecosystem variable, therefore itself alone is insufficient to prove there's a positive vegetation feedback. And the model vegetation feedback, again, is inconsistent, I showed you. Therefore, in this case, I think what we can contribute is the high-resolution multi-proxy data, even in a single core. If it's a multi-proxy, if you can with certain confidence separating the ecological part versus the climate part, then you might be able to tell if it really is a feedback involved in this process. Of course, even better if you have a synthesis in different regions, then you can even tell if it's just a local phenomena or it's a broader region. That would be even better, okay? And I think for the positive feedback here, to me, I think the strongest evidence of positive feedback still is just the magnitude of the North Africa. Still the classical, the picture will show the lake record, everything here. So if all the models so far fail that, I think it's strong evidence the model needs something. Is it directly vegetation feedback or involving dust or some other thing? I don't know yet, okay? But I feel this is still strongest evidence so far to me. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions? Thanks first.
Professor Liu, I guess one of the take-home messages I got is vegetation type may also play a very important role there. So maybe one thing, using your sentence, just within one core you can test, in this case, the contrast between middle Holocene event and this younger Dryas event. I think in the response they are different. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, we can check on the vegetation in both intervals. Mm-hmm. For example, C3, C4 mm-hmm. plains, or from the pollen record, you can see how much is high plains, how much is the grass. Mm-hmm. Maybe that also provides something to further test.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I haven't thought about that, even separating within the ecosystem, separating ecosystem, maybe different ecosystem has different implication. If we understand the response of different ecosystem, that might be also interesting, yeah.
I would like to come back to the differences between the two records that we have and that Carrie has discussed. And listening to your modeling experiment, I had some thoughts like are we not comparing two different things? One is in the ocean and it's dust. And to me, dust also imply an increase in wind strength. Can you comment on that?
In the model, it's not, in my model, it's not wind strength change. It's really I don't have dust flux in my model, okay? So, but what I can see is the vegetation cover change. Therefore, I can imply, if I have dust model, I can imply I have more, even with the same wind, I should have more dust flux. So in that sense, it's consistent. And so same thing in Martin Clausen's case, because we don't have dust model yet. Yeah, but because that dust flux is implied, sort of the land sort of proxy, especially the significance of Peter's call is that presumably because that's sort of a marine, unlike a single lake, it could be very regional phenomena. That one might have a broader implication. So that's why the record is very important in that sense. So, yeah.
When you do the Middle Holocene model runs, and you simulate land cover, and you have a land cover module.
Interactive vegetation. Yeah, interactive.
What about the soils? Because are you using then the properties of the desert soils that exist today? And then as sort of follow on to that, there's a hypothesis been kicking around for quite a while about the fact that GCMs, especially for the Sahara, underrepresent the albedo of Sahara desert soils, so they're maybe a lot brighter than the parameterization that you use in your model. And how could the difference then, if you would, have you done some sensitivity tests to see like if you would have, really much larger changes in albedo between grassland and desert, if that would change?
Yeah, well, our model has prescribed almost like a present-day albedo in the soil. The soil texture is fixed, doesn't change. And the soil itself could be another feedback that could be playing here. But just first, in your case, I didn't do experiment to artificially change because I'm sure if I change artificially too large, I can definitely get it. But the point is that the prescribed, the soil, the albedo, all those things is within the observed range. So it's more in the realistic range. So I don't want to change that too much. Okay, so one of the key questions I didn't hear. The challenge here, when we talk about the feedback, it's not Chinese albedo feedback is wrong. We are talking about further difficult question. We are talking about is his feedback overcoming the net feedback. As a result, the net feedback is positive feedback. Now that's a much harder problem. Okay, so in a sense, the realistic value is important because artificially, if I bump it up, of course I can get it there. You can see my tree already got a positive feedback. So it's in the right direction. It's just we think everything we think is realistic, it doesn't get there in this model. For the soil type, it's interesting, will be mentioned is that another feedback, we talk about this, the dust here. I was talking to Martin Clausen. One hypothesis he has is probably the soil type. Because when you have more precipitation, the soil, especially as a longer time scale, the soil can become, more dust-like, becoming more just the organic soil become darker. So that also reduces albedo. So there are also other feedback might be helping, which is not in our current model yet. Okay, so there are other things there. Yeah.
I've one other question, or maybe it's more a comment. At the last AGU, someone from Peter Domenical's group showed some new cores, basically very much from the vicinity of this particular one, and they all showed an absolutely gradual change, nothing abrupt at all. So that kind of questions the notion that there was a widespread abrupt change in vegetation, and it even raises the question how reliable this core material actually was. So can you comment on that, Leo?
Yeah, I talked to Peter. I saw him last September in Paris. There's a meeting there. He showed me the results. The problem with those cores is that they don't have the resolution. So it's not a disproof. He can, I suggest him, I said, well, you can use your core, you bing your core, you degrade your resolution. You will produce this core the same as other core. So it's not a disproof. So it's just, we don't know. It's just this core he has is so lucky. He has so high sediment rate, has so high resolution. He can separate this. He can tell this. Other core, it's not a disproof. It's consistent in the sense that the change, the abrupt change, his abrupt change is still breaked within other gradual change. The other core just don't have the resolution. So I think from the face, I would say that we don't know. It's still consistent. He also showed that last time, I don't want to speak for him. Yeah, anyway. Yeah. So I would say it's not disproved yet. Yeah.
And in the model study, the positive feedback is actually due to the soil moisture. So if you compare leaf area index and precipitation and say that there's no evidence for significant feedback, I think it's a little different from the model study. So have you looked at the soil moisture and precipitation?
Yeah, well, you see the experiment, we also have soil moisture. The soil moisture basically just follow the precipitation when you do this kind of experiment. So we could have done experiment, just do the initial condition from soil moisture. You know, we can do many experiments. But in this case, we didn't, because we are trying to just understand our experiment itself. We just did initial condition to change the fractional coverage change. Now, we did do some other experiment to change the leaf area index, and it's getting a little bit complicated. It was a seasonal cycle. It's in the middle. There's some more complicated than the explanation I'm giving here. But the upshot is that it's definitely not just a simple. Soil is somehow involved in this process. Okay? For example, when we do the statistics analysis, if we just do univariate statistics analysis, use monster data in this model, actually it's a positive feedback. But if we do partial correlation, we say if we fix soil moisture, we do partial correlation, then it becomes negative. So it's just it's consistent with our other results, other experiments when we just did leaf area index. It's vegetation, soil, they are interacting with each other in producing these results in this model.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you again, Lou.